Welcome back to the Vision of Escaflowne Retrospective, everyone. Having just finished looking at the secondary cast, it's time we now start to look at the big three, that of Alan, Hitomi, and Vaughn. Now, seeing that Vaughn and Hitomi are essentially the main characters of the series, we will start with Alan. Now, characters like Alan are the reason I examine supporting cast first, as it gives me additional time and additional angles and context with which to look at the main cast. And I'm glad I do in cases like this, because Alan's character is just such a layered one, and the extra time has really given me time to look at all these different layers. Now, when I first watched the series, Alan struck me as generic knight guy, someone cast in the trope of a knight in shining armor. That's about it. However, as the series progressed though, and as I rewatched more of it to make other videos, his character is explored more and more, and his layers became more apparent to me. Alan really starts to serve as a deconstruction of fantasy, in fact. I would say that's his main service to the show, in fact, that he provides a living deconstruction of many of the fantasy traits and tropes present in Escaflowne, and reinforces the show's themes of needing to make one's own fate and destiny using one's own agency. How he does this is simple in principle and nuanced in execution. In fact, Alan's character is such a layered and complex one that this is actually the second script I've had to type on the man, unsatisfied with my original and rambly 35-minute piece. This will hopefully be a more coherent and concise work, getting to the same points. I will take snippets from the original though, so please excuse some audio inconsistencies. One of these snippets will be the plot summary. We have a lot to get to, so instead of doing the usual plot paragraph essay component, I'm just going to name some bullet points of what this guy does in chronological order that I found, quote, most important. I'm sure I'm going to miss some things, but I'd like to think I covered all the important moments in this guy's story. Alan's place in the plot, if we boil it down to its simple bullet points, he appears in episode 3 when he rescues Vaughn and Hitomi from the swamp. He initially doesn't believe them about the attack on Finalia, although he has heard that Finalia is burning. He does end up teaming up with them though when Zybok forces attack his castle, which I guess is just on the outskirts of Astorius. This sees Vaughn captured, whom Alan does assist rescuing. Alan then goes to the king in a palace to plead on behalf of Vaughn. This doesn't really go anywhere, and instead Alan is just kind of set upon, I guess, by Malerna. He tries to shut her down with 2 or 3 lines, but that doesn't really go anywhere, and he kind of folds like a lawn chair. After that, he gets arrested for having associated with Vaughn having fled by this point. He gets rescued by Malerna so that he can help warn the Duchy of Freld that Zybok is going to attack him, but he just kind of shoves her away and goes on his own. He then gets stabbed, but luckily for him, Malerna ran away anyways and ends up saving him. This sees a wounded Alan now in the Duchy of Freld, where he pleads with Prince Sheed and eventually convinces Sheed to give them a chance and help prove their innocence. Although this does lead to an awkward scene later where Malerna basically deduces that Alan is actually Sheed's father, to which Alan basically goes, "You figured me out. I slept with your dead sister." Anyways, he then takes part in the losing battles of both of Godashim and the Fortuna Temple. He watches the Duke of Free die. Kind of just has a bad time, really. I want to pause right here for a second to say that this is kind of like the middle of the series, and from here, Alan's character really starts to, you start to see a lot more layers come out, and it's all kind of, I don't want to say downhill from here, but it gets a lot messier. Anyways, at this point, they run into the convoy with Dryden. Dryden saves Vaughn's life, although in return he does ask for the group to kind of help him find Atlantis. To do this, Dryden requests the logbook that Alan's father had given to him. Alan begrudgingly goes along with this because he does value the fact that Vaughn is alive, although he does say some backhand comment to Dryden, and for this Malerna basically tells him to shut up. This moment right here, at least to me, was kind of like the death of the character, and you'll see why. This is kind of like a turning point, which I'll elaborate on later. Anyways, he goes along with the group to Atlantis. Here, he meets his deadbeat dad. We learn from his backstory that Alan's childhood was actually kind of traumatic. His deadbeat dad bailed, and then his sister was abducted, and then his mother died of basically loneliness and heartbreak by this point, leaving a young Alan basically all by himself with no real guidance in the world. And this backstory does kind of do a good job of setting someone up who's kind of not quite comfortable with himself or interacting with others because he's just experienced a lot of loss so far. That doesn't justify some of his later actions, but I do understand what they're trying to do here. Anyways, he then gets sent to Zybok, and he reunites with everyone in Palace when he and Hitomi and Vaughn escape from Zybok. He accepts, quote-unquote, that Malerna's getting married. He kind of seems like, about it, but doesn't really oppose it. And then there's a big storm And this is where the Hitomi Incident takes place. Now, I don't know how most of the fandom feels about this, but as someone who just came, sight unseen, watched the show, this for me was a very uncomfortable moment because, okay, so in context, behind the strings, Fulkin and Dornkirk are like, we need to interrupt Hitomi and Vaughn's relationship. How are we going to do that? We're going to set Hitomi up with someone else. Okay, that part makes logical sense. How are we going to do this? We are going to literally manipulate fate to make Hitomi fall in love with someone else. Okay, that makes no sense in real life, but in the context of the series, the lore and laws of the world established, that does make sense. That's okay. The weird part is that they choose Alan, and that doesn't necessarily seem weird on the surface until we look at ages. And I commented on this in the original plot overview where I said, it is kind of weird that Hitomi is like 6 years younger than Alan, and one of them is an adult legally speaking, and the other one isn't. Again, I get it. This is supposed to be like the 13, 14, 1500s where that kind of thing happened. And I also get it in that this is supposed to be like a deconstruction of a teenage fantasy. I understand that. But looking on it just at a surface level, this does not look good. And it does make me a little uncomfortable. Again, I get it. This is supposed to be a deconstruction of a teenager's fantasy. But literally doing that, though, it just looks weird for reasons that I think are pretty obvious. It did make me a little uncomfortable. And past this point, Alan starts to manifest some behaviors which would make it uncomfortable even if they were both over 18, and we'll get more to that later. Anyways, after the Hitomi incident where he's quote-unquote manipulated to going along with this, he just kind of becomes a weirdo. We'll get some more on that later. He does fight in a few more battles. Hitomi leaves for a little bit, and while she's gone, Alan's long-lost sister Selena reappears, only for him to find out that it's the Landau. Oddly enough, though, this seems to be the one thing which she seems to take relatively well. And then once Hitomi comes back, something clicks, I guess, for him, and he realizes, you know what? I need to back off. I need to let her do her thing. I need time to figure myself out. And he basically says, you know what, Hitomi? You're free to go pursue Vaughn. Do whatever you'd like. You're your own person. He does take part in the final battle, which sees him save the Landau turned Selena. He saves her and then tells Vaughn basically, hey, Hitomi's waiting for you in Zybok. You should go tend to that. And then cut to credits. Yes, next scene he's in is in the credits, where he's with Selena looking over the grave of their mother, I assume. It seems like they've reconciled and that he has someone to talk to again. He suffered for lack of a family, it seems. And I hope he's doing better because this guy has a lot of layers. And to be quite honest, and I don't want to sound rude when I say this, but to be like 100% honest, he seems like someone that could benefit from therapy and someone to talk to. With Alan's place in the plot explained, watching Alan's evolution throughout the series is one of the most fascinating and, dare I say, even uncomfortable aspects of it. This is because of several important aspects of the character that we will explore in the following order. We will start by establishing the 3 different Alans. We will then transition into why Alan has these 3 different forms. Then we will look at how these forms impact the tone of the character. And finally, we will see how this accumulates to portray Alan as both a deconstruction of fantasy tropes and as, dare I say, the don't be like this character of Escaflowne. Before we establish who Alan's character impacts, though, and how it impacts the tone and themes of the series, we need to first establish what this character is. This is kind of difficult with Alan, though, because he tends to be inward and quiet. His personal feelings and his personal ideals are not really expressed very loudly, at least not by him, or at least not by his words. He isn't always honest with himself and or others, and this leads him to manifesting several different forms and ways of carrying himself. Now, these are not different personalities, they're just simply different parts of his personality coming through in different ways. The first of these forms is what we will call Knight Allen. Knight Allen is the guy we see on the box, the refined and calm knight who carries himself proudly and dignantly and always tries to help those in need. This is who Alan wants to be. We see this Alan when he fights to protect the town, or when he gives Vaughn advice about swordplay or something. This is a mature facade of sorts, which represents what Alan strives to be while denying any sort of emotional insecurity or issues which he currently faces. Should issues in Alan's personal and emotional life arise, though, this polished exterior starts to chip away, and soon gives rise to what we will call professional Alan. This is the guy who, while still doing what it says on the box, isn't quite enthused about it. This is a guy who gets kind of snarky from time to time and goes along with things at this point because it's kind of his job and he feels obligated to. We see this Alan start to pop up after the trip to Freld, and especially in his early interactions with Dryden. This version of the character is one on the defensive, as a man looking to both manifest some grievances, yet still remain in the objective lines of who he wants to be, i.e. he still does the right thing, and he doesn't necessarily manifest any negative behaviors yet, but his mood has already been negatively impacted. Now, these grievances seem to manifest from a personal sense of loss, and the fact that he seems to loathe his perceived lack of agency. We will address this in the next segment. Professional Allen does serve as a bridge of sorts, though, between Knight Allen and the final form of Uncomfortable Allen. The bridge between the two is finally crossed in one of the first scenes that Allen shares with Malerna and Dryden, where Dryden basically asks for Allen's help going to Atlantis. Allen gets snarky with him, and Malerna basically tells him to shut up. Now, this is a very critical scene in Allen's character development, as not only does it start to delineate our full trip into Allen's psyche, but it kind of serves as the death of the character. Before this point, Professional Allen was just kind of snarky, but he was still Allen. This moment right here, and all of its very palatable uncomfortableness and awkwardness, though, shows that Allen is actually quite flawed, or at least very human at his core, and this begins our transition into Uncomfortable Allen. Now, Uncomfortable Allen is the final Allen we see, and while I don't want to say that it's his, quote, true form, it's the one which most openly manifests his own emotional inner turmoil. We see this Allen the most in later interactions with Hitomi, and a few other scenes. I deem this form Uncomfortable Allen because it seems that he's both uncomfortable with himself and interacting with others, and this leads to him exhibiting behaviors which may make others even more uncomfortable, such as being overprotective and, dare I say, controlling. We see this most in his relationship with Hitomi, which, quick note, again, the ages between the two do make me uncomfortable, seeing as that one is on one side of 18 and the other is not. Obviously that's bad, but I don't think that was a thing the writers consciously thought about. I think that's just an oopsie in the writer's room. No one dared to say, hey, I know this is a literal deconstruction of a teenager fantasy, but maybe we should cast someone who's not still a teenager, you know? I think that's more of an oopsie in the logistical end of things. I think what happened was a lot different than what was meant to happen, or that the writers didn't necessarily take the implications of the ages in the full consideration. However, I want to point out, though, that this form of Allen is uncomfortable regardless of the age, and his relationship with Hitomi would still be awkward and uncomfortable even if they were the same age, because of the behaviors that he manifests. He seems emotionally stunted, and his interactions with Hitomi prove this, as he seems overprotective or doubtful and even a little controlling. Even without taking their uncomfortable age gap into consideration, it still would be awkward and kind of uncomfortable watching this carry out, even if they were both, say, 20. These negative behaviors, of course, stem from Allen's personal trauma and his inability to properly open up and discuss his personal traumas and tackle his own demons. Now, these traumas are the source of Allen's stunted emotional growth and are linked mostly to his childhood. Allen had a pretty unpleasant childhood, owing mostly to the fact that his father, a character I actively hate and had a 5-minute rant recorded about, which I can post if you'd like, walked out for quote-unquote reasons. He says it's to make fate, but again, I hate this character, and the way they write him is not particularly graceful or agreeable. And this left Allen to care for his younger sister Selena, who gets kidnapped, and his mother, who essentially dies of despair, alone. Having lost everyone from no fault of his own, Allen of course is traumatized, and this installs into him a burning loneliness and a fear of loss. These two often get into each other's way, though, as ending loneliness requires company, which creates something to lose and therefore intensifies the fear of loss. Since solving one inflates the other, Allen is essentially stuck in a sort of negative loop. This isn't helped either by his early attempts to fix it by bonding with Marlene. While Allen's relationship with Marlene isn't explored in any real detail, it's obvious that the two did seem to have quite a strong relationship with each other, and it's obvious that its fractured ending did leave a negative mark on him. The loss of this major pillar of support for him seems to have made him much more withdrawn, and this further reinforces Allen's tendency to bottle up his emotions and emotionally isolate himself, lying to himself and others about how he truly feels. All of this creates a character whose tone is kind of all over the place as the series progresses. Early Allen, Knight Allen that is, appears in a lot of episodes very consistently before the trip to Frayed, and it's a relatively straightforward performance of, Knight Allen. Past this point though, He increasingly starts to share the screen with both professional and uncomfortable Allen, leading to an odd mishmash of presence and actions and tone depending on the circumstances of the scene. If it's a big fight and Allen needs to be Knight Allen, he will fight the good fight. But as soon as we go back to a quieter scene, or he has to interact with Hitomi or something, it starts to get real weird real fast. Escaflowne's writing does a good job of exploring Allen's character's layers though, without directly going into character assassination. I will let you decide if that point was reached at all. His portrayal does grow less consistent as the series progresses, however, it is consistent in that it explores facets which are established early on, i.e. Escaflowne's writing does a good job establishing a character which is consistent enough within its own boundaries to believe that all the Allens are different forms of the same guy. And this is important because it allows Allen to serve as the ultimate fantasy trope deconstruction. As said in several videos by this point, even though Escaflowne is a fantasy piece, one of its greatest strengths is how it successfully deconstructs and disproves many tropes inherent of the genre. Allen is probably the best example of this, as while Knight Allen establishes early on that, hey, there are knights in shining armor here, his evolution throughout the series disproves the naive idea that makes him like the perfect guy. He proves that there is no fantasy perfect knight, and that really there's no perfect fantasy everyone, that even if they can stick to outside codes of honor, everyone is still flawed in some way. He proves that someone can be, quote, honorable or chivalrous, and still not necessarily perfect, or pleasant, or mature and honest. He is a literal knight in shining armor, and yet still very flawed, and at times even unlikable, even if he does try to stick to chivalry most of the time. His presence serves as a sort of wake-up call not only for Molerna, but also one for the audience to the naive foibles present in the genre. Allen also serves as a wake-up call in the sense that I think he is the don't be like this character of the series. Now, this kind of character is relatively self-explanatory, a character defined by some sort of flaw which they manifest and in turn say to the viewers, careful, don't be like this guy. Allen's very unique in this regard though, as he's a protagonist in a role which is usually reserved for, if not antagonists, then some kind of supporting character. Examples we've covered on this channel include Alan Gabriel, the flaw of narcissistic nihilism, Daedalus Yameno, the flaw of just big nihilism, Tony Frost, the flaw of big narcissism, and Ukyo, the flaw of apathy and, I'm gonna say it, probably psychopathy. Allen's writing is more subtle and nuanced in these examples though, as again, the point of his character is to sort of serve as a layered deconstruction of the knight in shining armor. He proves that the writers did know what they were doing, and were saying that, hey, even a knight can manifest these flaws, so be careful that you don't. But what are these flaws in question? These are the central flaws of Allen's character, and the show tells us to avoid them, and these flaws are emotional dishonesty and repression, combined with a bit of failure to exercise one's own agency. I think it's obvious by this point that at Allen's core, there is a big knot of emotional baggage that he simply tries to ignore, or kind of just tune out, and that it unduly affects both his judgment and his behavior. He isn't flawed because he's hurt. He isn't flawed because he's experienced pain. Those are human things, and no one can hold those against someone. He's flawed because he actively tries not to talk about them, because he actively tries not to work on them, and at times he even ignores offers of others to help him through them. The show is saying, hey, don't be like this guy. Talk about your feelings and make yourself who you want to be. And this ties in with Allen's second great flaw, which is that he seemingly uses very little of his, what I imagine to be great agency, to fix his personal life. In fact, it seems he makes very few decisions for himself at all. Now, obviously Allen doesn't decide to get traumatized as a child, and I don't blame him for accepting Balgus's offer to become a knight. Pretty reasonable. However, once he becomes a knight, Allen doesn't really do that much as far as we know. I mean, let's be honest, as an elite knight Kaylee, he's obviously got a lot of responsibilities, but I imagine he also gets a good amount of pay and some kind of renown. He seems relatively charismatic, and he's definitely a skilled knight. So, I mean, while these traits don't define a person, they could definitely be used by Allen to do his own thing and discover himself. There's a lot of options open to him. The world could be his oyster. He could really make a fresh start, in fact. But instead, all he really does is date his boss's daughter, something that he knows he shouldn't do, and that definitely crosses a professional boundary, and then becomes sad when this relationship doesn't work for dynastic reasons. Now, it is tragic that their love ends that way, I'm not going to deny that, but seeing as that he knowingly crossed a professional line and simply won't move on, that is something of note. I mean, it's been like 5 years and she's literally dead. I know that sounds very harsh, but at this point, he needs to move on, and fixating on the past is just, it's not healthy. It's time to at least start moving on, baby steps at least. Again, Alan's central flaw is not that he has trauma, but that he actively represses it and tries not to move on, and this leads him to not using his agency. Since he hasn't completely moved on from Marlene, even though it's been like 3 years, he allows Malerna to just kind of enter into his life to act as a sort of weird substitute for her dead sister. This is something which reasonably he should not be doing because A, there's another uncomfortable age gap here. I know I should have said something about that in the Dryden episode, but they were both engaged to each other as minors, which was a thing nobility did. So while that is still kind of weird and uncomfortable, in a historical context it kind of makes sense for Dryden. In this case though, it's just kind of weird because Alan is, I guess, accepting the advances of the younger sister of his dead lover because he never quite got over her, and B, because she's already engaged. And I know he has a throwaway line where he's like, I don't know if we should do this, but he doesn't really, shut her down. He doesn't really stop her. He doesn't take action, is what I'm saying. He kind of lets others make decisions for him, and then gets upset when decisions he sleepwalk into don't necessarily pan out very well. And if the central theme of Escaflowne is making one's own fate and using one's own agency to do so, it has to be noted that Alan fails at both, and he kind of just goes through the motions of things and then laments when his fate isn't as he had hoped. He's just complacent sometimes, and I feel that's why he's a warning to us, why he is the don't be like this character of Escaflowne, because at the end of the day, while he had great potential, while he is an elite knight, and he is in shining armor, he isn't a perfect man.